I would like to finish mine and turn the microphone over to Dr. Laura McNamee. Laura McNamee is a research associate in the Center for Science and Industry. Laura is single-handedly responsible for most of the direction of our research at the present time. Laura had the courage to come join us 2 to 3 years ago when we kind of could show, we had a feeling there's a problem and really fishing around to what could we study, how can we make a difference, what are the types of things that we should be doing at Bentley to try to accelerate this translation of science for public benefit. I'm equally grateful to Laura for her direction and her insights, and I will turn the microphone over to her.
I'll set this up.
Thank you, Fred. It has been my pleasure to work with you these past few years, and it's so exciting to see the center come to fruition. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this session today. It is truly inspiring to be in the presence of such an elite group of inventors and entrepreneurs and leaders. I'm sure we'll all learn a lot. Each talk will be 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. And as Fred mentioned earlier, you can follow us at Sci Industry, and please tweet on InventBiz. And now for our first speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. BruceLeicher. Bruce's experiences are exemplary of the importance of engaging non-scientists in the process of translating innovation into public value. Bruce is currently Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Momenta Pharmaceuticals, and has previously held senior roles at Millennium, Genetics Institute, Wyeth, and BBN. He has extensive experience in advising biotech and high-tech companies in research, development, and commercialization of products. Bruce received his BA in psychology from University of Rochester and has a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. Please join me in welcoming Bruce to our symposium.
Thank you, Laura. Boy, it's great to see such a turnout. I'm BruceLeicher, as you just heard, and I'm actually just really pleased to be here today. First, I want to thank Bentley University for creating the Center for the Integration of Science and Industry, and especially Gloria Larson for being here to show her commitment. And I want to thank Fred for everything he's done, as well as Laura and Donna for all, and the whole staff for all the hard work in pulling the symposium together. I think today's going to be a really exciting opportunity to learn about how science can move from the lab and from the university into business. And the speakers that follow me are all scientists. I'm not. They're going to offer more of a technical view into this. And I suspect many of you in the audience, like me, are not scientists. And what I was going to try and do is share some thoughts about why what you do matters. I mean, maybe this came up in a conversation earlier. I wanted to point out, I've worked. You'll see a bunch of the places I've worked in the Boston region, and I can't think of a marketing department, a finance department, an accounting department at any of the companies I've been in where I haven't worked with a Bentley grad. And it's always been a pleasure. So it's great to be here today. So let me get to the next slide. So although I'm a lawyer, and I grew up always sort of having a little bit of a love of science, and one of the reasons that I moved to Boston 30 years ago was to work as a lawyer with high-tech companies. And I didn't really know a whole lot about Boston and what that opportunity was going to be back then, but in hindsight, it was, for me, the right decision. When you look at the knowledge base here, the level of investment, the number of universities, the companies, the variety of technologies, it's unsurpassed, I think, anywhere in the country. And I think it's just a great place to set up the Center for Integration of Science and Industry for just that reason. Let me give a little background and sort of how I sort of developed these thoughts. As a lawyer, though, I'm always kind of surprised every time I get a call to come and maybe talk a little bit about science innovation, because lawyers are often, and maybe it's fair to say they're perceived to be pretty conservative and not risk takers, and in many companies obstacles to getting things done, and maybe in a lot of places. I'm usually the first person to protest wildly and disagree. And I think when lawyers do it right, when they're properly engaged, they actually have the opposite effect in my view. And we help with the creation of the companies, with financing of companies, how to create the intellectual property into a form that it could be sold and transferred, in terms of navigating complicated regulatory pathways. All of these things are obstacles that have to be overcome beyond the scientific breakthroughs that you'll have to be involved with. And if there's one thing I can encourage everyone to do is to figure out how to hold your lawyers accountable, and there's a way to do that. You can manage your lawyers really well if you get them involved early, if you teach them about what you're doing so that they actually understand what you're frustrated with and what you're trying to get done, because they'll then get excited. They'll become part of your team. You'll probably have more options available as you're working through it, and the lawyers will probably be more creative and more useful when it's all said and done. So when I moved to Boston, I was at a firm in Washington, D.C. for a few years, but when I moved to Boston, I joined a leading firm. At the time it was Hale & Dorr in Boston, and worked for a number of high-tech companies. But not long after arriving, I had an opportunity to do what I actually really wanted to do, was join a science company. It was to go and join the first general counsel, was just hired at a company called the BBN in the high-tech space. And for me, it was really an amazing place. Although they were a corporation, it was an academic environment largely filled with just hundreds of PhDs who were leaders in artificial intelligence, computing, networking, and they were, and the internet. And this is back in 1984. They were actually the company that invented the internet back in 1969, working for the federal government. They were originators of some of the first natural language search engines that today you know as Google. Like Fred's dad, they were doing this 20 years before it actually became more mainstream. They sold some of the first scientific data computing software packages back in the 80s. And it was just a really exciting place to work. From BBN, I moved on to the life sciences and actually more or less walked across the street to Genetics Institute. It was one of the early biotech companies, and it had the same feel. And there I had an opportunity to work with, biologists and chemists, but another really amazing group of scientists and engineers as they collaborated with academia, which was a big part of biotech then, as well as big pharma. And at the time when we were discovering and developing some of the first breakthrough biotech products, things like EPO, recombinant factor VIII, recombinant factor IX for hemophilia, and this whole new world of blood cell growth factors that we now hear about as all the breakthroughs in trying to treat cancer. And it was for me, it was just remarkable to just sort of get to experience that. And after Genetics Institute was acquired, I tend to have a taste to be in smaller companies. I moved on to several early stage biotech companies and sort of had much more of a senior role at that point, helping them learn how to move from discovery into development and potential commercialization. And more recently, I'm at as you heard, at Momenta Pharmaceuticals, and we're in the business of translating a bunch of discoveries that came out of MIT on how to, that are focused on analyzing complex mixtures and complex pharmaceutical products so that you can make generics out of products that could not have been genericized in the past. So it's a way to make older products more affordable and accessible to patients as we see healthcare costs go up. And we're also now applying that to the field of biologics because there's a new pathway available for generic biologics. And I may talk a little bit about that a little later. So what I'd like to do is shift gears now, though, and talk more about what is it that worked at some of these companies and didn't work in terms of being successful at translating. And this is a book that someone once wrote about BBN, which if you're interested in sort of what it was like back then, it's actually kind of a fun book to go through. But you know, at BBN, the computer scientists were developing. Essentially, they had to create the whole information theory. How do you route information from computers that could not talk to each other across a network that allowed them to talk to each other and come up with this idea without anyone giving them any roadmap or knowledge. And they had to do it at a time when, as Fred actually said, you set this up perfectly, when the computer hardware really didn't exist to do it. So it really took, how do you write a computer program with 150 lines of code that today someone could write with 10,000 lines of code? And it was remarkable. And to give you a sense of, a little bit of sense of GI, this is, I don't know if anyone's ever gone to the Wayback Machine. The Wayback Machine is a website that archives every ancient website page. So if you go to the Wayback Machine, you can look up what was on the Genetics Institute website in 1994. Just an aside. But they, at GI, the scientists were working on identifying and cloning genes, basically to make recombinant proteins, but they were doing it at the same time that you had to invent the technology to make recombinant proteins. So it was just not a trivial task. And they were also doing it at the same time, and this is where the business side comes in. They had to figure out, well, how do you navigate the regulatory pathway? How do you conduct very large clinical trials without running out of money, which they're very expensive? How do you collaborate with large pharma companies and enter into business deals that actually work well for both sides? And often we were working on teams of people that had done this for the first time in their career, so there was a huge learning curve involved, but it was also a lot of fun for that reason. And from there, at the next generation of companies that I went to, the technology had been proven, but we'd moved on more at future companies that I was at of sort of, well, let's discover the products that can cure new diseases. So if you're stepping back a little, these were all very high risk and frequently unsuccessful projects. And so what is it that occurred at these companies that those of us who aren't scientists could do that could make a difference so that you'd be more likely or maybe less likely to succeed? And the first observation I'll make is you've got to have great people and great ideas, but you got to have a company that's willing to take risks. And the breakthroughs I saw really came from people who were just passionate about what they were doing. People just wanted to go to work every day and just have a good time doing it, and were just driven and engaged and believed in what they were doing. And as a result, and maybe it goes both ways, just were not scared off by the risk of failing. And BBN in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was that way. And it allowed them to say, we're not going to be scared off by the fact that we don't have the hardware. And they developed the core technologies that led to what now exists to all of us as the internet. But what was interesting, and I was there during the latter stages of BBN's time frame, was after 20 years of pioneering activity, as they grew and financial concerns became more real and more challenging because it grew in size and in scale, the company became more risk adverse. This is really a classic story from there. Back in 1988, one of the key scientists realized that the entire internet was moving from what was the mini computers and the large mainframes you saw the pictures of to everyone having PCs. And that what the networking exercise was going to be is what you each have in your home probably now, is a little router that connects to your PC, that connects you to the internet. And there were no routers back then. And the scientist comes into management and says, you know what, if we want to stay in this business, we need a router. And they said, well, we're going to have to invest money to develop this router, and we're not going to do that. And he said, okay, goodbye. And he walked out the door. He started a company up in Burlington called Wellfleet Communications. There were some other colleagues, I see people here shaking their heads, who in California started a company called Cisco. And within about 2 years, Wellfleet and Cisco were worth probably in excess of $1 billion. I don't know the exact numbers. And BBN was never worth more than $300 million. And that's over one router. And and that's where the marketing matters. It's really paying attention to what's going on. You can't just have the science. They had all the tools. They had all the science. They just couldn't get themselves to invest in the future. The next thing is you need folks to really be engaged and want to do it, and they're there because they want to be there. They're probably there longer than you might expect them to be there for that reason, but when they're there, they're engaged, and it's a sense that when you walk around, that people feel like they're having fun, they're making a difference, they feel connected to the organization, and I've seen that happen, and I've seen it not work. But when it works, the result is they think about what they're doing because they want to. They think about the problems and solutions when they're sort of off the clock, which probably leads them to, like anyone working in the sciences, to come up with some pretty interesting, creative solutions. And people generally have a little more fun, and great things seem to happen. So when I was at GI, I really had a sense that was what was going on. Gabe Smerling, who was the founder and CEO of GI, is actually one of my favorite examples of this. He was a very kind of nondescript guy. If you saw him walking down the hall, you wouldn't imagine him as a CEO. He was shy. He wasn't a particularly good speaker. He brought his lunch to work in a brown paper bag. He often ate at his desk. But he was probably one of the most inspirational people at the company. And it was interesting. You walk and talk to anyone, and everyone just adored him. And what it was when he engaged with anyone, he was just completely respectful and interested in what they had to say. He engaged with them, and it got them engaged in him and in the business. He basically earned everyone's complete trust. He demanded, in a way that I describe it as quietly and really by modeling behavior, that every employee should just have an opportunity to live up their full potential. And what he did was try to give everyone a chance, and this was, it flowed from the top, to have this sort of an opportunity to really build their careers at the company. So there was a sense of, I'm gonna learn something here every day. I'm gonna do something with my life at this company, and he never took credit for any of the successes at the company. It was always, look at what so and so was able to do this week, and look at what this team did, and it didn't matter whether you were a scientist, a bottle washer, even thank the lawyers once in a while. And the other thing he was really good at, which I think had a big effect on this, was his acceptance of failure. That's what I was talking about earlier. And the result was people were not worried about giving him bad news. So he always knew what was going on. He wasn't like many CEOs are starved for information about what's happening in the company and making good decisions. And because people were comfortable that he would be supportive when they came to him with bad news, there was a sense that you could just have a conversation, and it just makes a huge difference. So let me switch. So when I was at Millennium, the leadership there was actually really quite good in many respects, and in some ways it was even more engaged at the leadership level and enthusiastic. But what was odd for me, contrasting the experience, is it didn't have the same effect on the employees. There were a lot of speeches, there were a lot of meetings, there were a lot of parties, there were great slogans, things like nothing is impossible, or everyone's got to get focused on execution, we're going to get this done, or we're going to get that done. But it just didn't get traction. And that was odd in a way, because I probably worked with some of the smartest people I've ever worked with there. But they weren't as engaged. They weren't as motivated. And I guess, you know, when I look back, my sense is that the leadership came across as a we and a they. It was always, you know, kind of like you see in politics. The politicians are up there saying, you got to do this, you got to do this, but you don't feel like you're part of them. And it's interesting, you know, during the time, GI probably invented, you know, tens of products during the 10 years I was there, and during the entire time of Millennium's essential existence, during 10 years, they invested hundreds of millions of dollars in research. Their only marketed products were products they acquired from other companies. And that could be happenstance. I'm not sure. The other factor, and I threw up on the slide, is compensation, bureaucracy, and scale can also be counterproductive. And when Big Pharma buys a biotech, which often happens when a biotech's successful, you can often see the passion disappear. GI was acquired by Wyeth, and I was there for a few years, and as you heard, at Wyeth. And you know, the effect was cash compensation increased. People actually made a little more money. There was even a little more money to spend in your budgets. But the management and the control over how it got spent, even if you had more to spend, was really demotivating for, I think, a lot of people. And, you know, the belief that we were all on the same team, and these were people who had grown up together, just shifted. It was really interesting to a we and the they with senior management. I was in senior management then. It just didn't feel good. And this, you know, the scientists were driven, but often kind of restrained. One of them gave me an example once. He said, if you took a beaker and you put fruit flies in it, there's probably people in the room who know this, and you put a piece of paper on top of the beaker, and then you wait about, I don't know how long you have to wait, but you wait a period of time and you take the piece of paper off, the fruit flies don't come out of the beaker anymore. And that's kind of what it felt like with, that's the way he was describing the atmosphere, is folks were just not feeling like they were going to go and figure out what to do. And that's kind of sad. So the next observation I wanted to make is it's not just science. The business really matters too. And you know, the decision I talked about earlier, the decision not to invest in the router, was just not a risk-taking error, but a failure to recognize where the market was going. You know, from mini computers and computers to PCs, and what kind of innovation you might need. You know, you really can't ignore, and that's where, you know, what everyone in this room, as they get out, you know, if they're not out there already, when you get out there, is it can really contribute a lot, is paying attention to what the future is. And the challenge also comes up at the science level in biotech, because often an idea is just a fantastic scientific idea, but if there's no market for it, investing resources into development of a great invention also isn't a great idea. And it's really hard to let go of great ideas. I can assure you of that. I get trapped in them as well. And that's where some hard management has to come in. One example which I was involved with was this company called Curis, and Curis was one of the first regenerative medicine companies. It came out of a company called Ontogeny that merged into it, that was focused on regrowing tissue and organs. And it had a product that this is back in development back in 2000, that was a tissue implant that was designed to treat incontinence associated with aging. And it involved harvesting cells from the patient and constructing in a scaffold and re-injecting it back into the patient. So you were basically using the body to treat itself and regrow the tissue so that you could control incontinence. And it worked beautifully. But the cost of doing it was in the neighborhood of about $10,000 per patient. And what was not recognized at the time was there was a company in Sweden that had figured out how to basically do the same thing with a polymer that cost about $500 for the treatment. And so they basically went through about a $10 to $20 million development program, for which out of their $40 million of capital was highly costly to them, and had a product that could never really launch. And everyone was just so focused on the science and how great it was that it was, no one was paying attention. Wait a minute, there's something else going on in the world, and that's really where the marketing folks can help. Then really the final point I wanted to bring up is it's the business environment and law and politics can often change the outcome of great science. So you really can't ignore that either. And I know Alan's here today. He may talk about that a little bit at the end too. But I've been in too many situations where, and this is positive and negative, where the law and politics associated with science are probably more often driven by economics than by the science, whether we like it or not. So you just need to pay attention. And a positive example is BBN's decision to go into the networking business and actually start building the internet was a legally created opportunity with the breakup of AT&T. It wasn't available before that, and they realized that was an opportunity. They went and expanded and were able to sell, and for 10 years had quite a good business before they didn't build the router, selling global data networks. And another good example is at the time the biotech industry was emerging in the late 70s and early 80s, Congress passed the Bayh-Dole Act. And what that law made it possible to do is for universities to then retain intellectual property ownership and patent inventions made in the labs and license them to biotech companies. And it created a real opportunity for biotech and academia to collaborate and develop many of the products that are now being launched. And lastly, my recent time at Momenta sort of amplifies this as well. A significant part of what we're doing now is really a result of two things. One, it's the scientific innovation that makes it possible, but there was no legal opportunity to take advantage of that science. We're involved in the development of the field of generic biologics, and up until the Affordable Care Act was passed, which had a section of it creating the opportunity for the FDA to license biosimilars. There was, even if we had developed the drug, we couldn't have sold it, and now there's an opportunity to do that, and it matters. If you look at the cost of, as biologics patents expire, if there were no competitive alternatives, the cost that society will spend for a drug that's, a biologic that's 20 years old is astronomical if it remains a monopoly. There's a real, and so, our employees are really excited about the opportunity, and it also involves quite a bit of innovation of how do you develop the science that allows you to thoroughly understand what the existing product is so that you can know that you're making essentially exactly the same thing. So with that, I'm just going to leave you with a few, with just sort of my conclusions, which are what I've said already, which is I think what you do matters because it's not just the science. Great people and ideas are needed, but without taking the risk and having leadership that lets you take risk, it's not going to happen. I think for those of you who are students out there and you have a choice over what you're going to do, go for the mentoring opportunity over any other opportunity, and I think you'll be way ahead. And I think you'll find that companies that foster those kinds of environments are going to be the ones where people are most engaged. And that, you need good business judgment, not just the science, and you got to pay attention to the law and politics. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
I'm going to pass the mic around, so Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Jolson. I'm an undergrad here at Bentley. I was just curious, in your experience with working with all these businesses, was the environment of the business, okay, today, how can we make money? Or was it, okay, today, what new science can we develop? And if there was a mixture of both, where were the employees more happy, and what affected the fields the most, the fields of science the most?
I don't know that there's a single answer. You know, in the emerging companies, what you have the opportunity to do is make everyone an owner of the business. So, and I think 20 years ago, the sharing of the economics was probably flatter than it is today. I'm not sure why that is. I always argue for a little bit flatter. I don't always succeed. I think as the biotech industry recruited pharmaceutical executives into its ranks, it became more big business-like. So that's sort of one dimension. At the level you're asking the question, though, when people when people have a stake in the business and they see the value of the company going up, that does have I won't deny, that does have a positive influence on people's happiness with going to work, because they feel like they're personally making some money out of it. So there's a piece of that. But when it's all said and done, that's not always happening in a lot of these companies. You're often doing a lot of work with a long road to hoe before you ever make any money. And then what it really comes down to is the leadership willing to let people build careers. You can always build a career even if the company's not succeeding. And if they let, I believe, if you let people build their careers by actually doing really good work, there's a way for them to engage as well. So it's more than one thing.
Just a comment. You trace the history to a large extent, history of biotech toward, say, late 90s. I must comment. I had the honor and also privilege to work for Fred Ledley and also a friend, Mark. He sandwiched between the GI, Genetic Institute, and also Millennium Pharmaceuticals. I must also mention here that was his idea. He encouraged two of us to develop an idea which spawned the so-called HapMap project, which is hundreds of millions of dollars project. And then so it is. I think, to my knowledge, no one has given that sort of leadership in this genetics niche as much as Fred Ledley did. Thanks.
Questions?
Hi, I thought it was really interesting how at BBN they had like the vision to pursue a project that at the time probably seemed absolutely crazy to most of the country. And then also the question really is just how could then the management kind of be so blind to the future and the whole router thing when back when they started pursuing the invention of the internet, they would take it seems like that would be like jumping off a cliff, how risky it is. But then with the routers, they just kind of weren't willing to do it.
I'm not sure I know the complete answer. My perception is that first at the time they bid on the ARPA contract in 1969, they were probably 25 employees. They were bidding on a contract, so they were taking a risk of $50,000 to $100,000 in writing a proposal and working after hours to write the proposal while they were doing other work for other clients. They were essentially a consulting firm. By the time they were having to design the router, it was, are we going to invest in developing a product ourselves that we don't know that we're going to need to sell? And what I think they didn't have, because they were not traditionally a products business, was an experienced enough marketing and business staff beyond the government contracting realm to actually say, this is worth investing in and you're not throwing your money away, is maybe the answer. But in hindsight, everything looks easy. Yes.
First of all, I would like to thank you for coming. And second, my question is related to leadership. And, well, you have a huge experience in your field, and you've been in many companies. And I would like to know, as you have told us, for example, with the VBN example of the router, and so what do you think about what's the best leadership way or system in the biotechnology companies? And for example, is it more inclined to the science department and projects and inventions, or maybe more a business influence way of leadership?
I'm not sure I understand the second half.
Okay, so for example, let's say in BBN, they weren't seeing the opportunities of having a second router, so they failed, as you said. And so what do you think about having the leadership in the company? Should it be a more balanced or business-wise, or more focused on the science department?
So what the difference I see between what was happening there and maybe what I was just talking about Gabe Smerling a little bit is if someone had come to Gabe and said, I really think this makes sense and it's a fantastic, and this is why, and this is what the idea is, he would have said, here, go talk to this person in the marketing group and go figure that out. And then come back and talk to me again, as opposed to going off as a management team and saying, we decide not to do this. He would never shut an idea down. He might actually believe that something. He might have believed that something was a bad idea, but the way he managed people was he would manage them to go and figure it out for themselves, that they would come to the conclusion that was the right conclusion, whether it was positive or negative. So it was to let, you know, maybe it's the principle that the management is just a small group of people, but you've got this company of a lot of really smart people. Don't throw away the smart people's good ideas.
Thank you, Bruce. Very nice talk.